Hi everyone, my name's Caitlin Hartley, and I am doing a podcast today on how we can create a classroom environment to help motivate our students. And just a little bit of background about myself. I am a senior family consumer science education major at Brigham Young University, Idaho. And over the past few months, I have tried to understand more about motivation and management in a classroom setting, specifically a family consumer science classroom. I'm getting prepared to go out and teach in classrooms, various junior highs and high schools throughout the country. And I've also had the experience to be in several family consumer science classrooms the past few months in different high schools in the Idaho area. And so with these experiences, I really wanted to develop my own motivation and management strategies for my future family consumer science classroom. So as I've studied, I've just decided to compile everything I've learned so far and share it with you, and I hope that it will help you have a better understanding and idea of how you can motivate students in your family consumer science classrooms. So as I've been studying motivation, I've read a couple books that I highly recommend, and I'm going to reference them quite a bit throughout this podcast. The first book that I highly recommend is Punished by Rewards by Alfie Kohn, and also Drive by Daniel Pink is a fantastic book. Also with Daniel Pink, he has a fantastic TED Talk called Puzzle of Motivation. It's about 15 minutes long, and it sums up a lot of his book Drive. So if you have a few minutes during your day, I highly recommend you check out that TED Talk. And so we're just going to dive into the podcast now. Daniel Pink, in his book Drive, he gives 3 levels of motivation. So I'd like to touch on each one of those and go into deeper of how that applies into our classroom, specifically family consumer science classrooms. So the first level of motivation he gives is biological drive. I'm not going to touch on that too much, but simply what biological drive means is that we're trying to meet our basic needs. We're motivated to do things to meet our needs of hunger, of transportation, of shelter, of clothing. So basically an example would be, I'm hungry because I need food, so I'm motivated to make myself some food to satisfy my hunger. So that's the basic level of motivation, is to meet our biological needs. Now the second level of motivation we're going to talk about a little more in depth. The second level that Daniel Pink gives is the motivation through rewards and punishments. And he makes it really clear in his book, and I think you'll agree with him as well, that rewards and punishments to motivate students is embedded throughout our society. We see evidence every day of this in classrooms with token economies, with various incentives, and also punishments. We see detention, we see recess privileges taken away. Just a few examples of how it's embedded throughout society. I myself grew up in a home that was very based on rewards and punishments, and I also attended schools that were very rooted in this motivation philosophy of rewards and punishments. And since doing my studies on motivation, I have come to find that there's a better way to motivate students, and that's how I'm going to implement motivation in my classroom, and we'll discuss that later on. But first, I just want to give 5 arguments that Alfie Kohn gives in his book, Punished by Rewards, against rewards and punishments. And these are very compelling, and I hope it'll help you think of what rewards and punishments actually do to students. Okay? So here we go. The first argument that he gives is that rewards and punishments manipulate the behavior of others. This simply means that a teacher can enforce a reward or punishment, and she's doing it to manipulate the students into doing what she desires them to do. An example of this in a family consumer science classroom could be, we could say that there's a cooking group, who at the end of every class period leave without cleaning their kitchen properly. And so the teacher could give them a reward, and she could say, okay, if you keep your kitchen clean for a week straight, then I'll give you extra credit points on your upcoming tests. Well, what does that do to the students? Are they learning really how to properly clean their kitchen? No, they're just going to rush through it and do it to get those extra credit points. And then when that week's over and the incentive is gone, the extra credit is gone, then the following week it can be highly likely that the students will just go right back to their routine. Again, rewards and punishments manipulate students. Okay, now the second argument that Cohn gives is that rewards and punishments hinder relationships. And this has a lot to do with competition in a classroom. For example, you could say in a nutrition and cooking class that you have, let's say you have 30 students, so you have 6 groups of 5, and you have a cookie competition, and the group that makes the best cookies are going to make those cookies for a school banquet that's coming up. Well, that way, when you do that, you're putting students against each other. They now see other groups as hindrances to their success. Essentially, they have to do better than someone else to achieve success. And there's a better way to do that in a classroom, and we'll talk about that. And it's not through competition, because again, that hinders relationships. It puts students against each other. Now, the third argument against rewards and punishments is that they ignore reason. For example, going back to that kitchen cleaning example in the first argument, again, that ignores reason by giving them extra credit points, because it's not teaching them how to properly clean a kitchen, and it's not teaching them why it's a problem. The students really need to be taught what the problem is, how they can fix the problem, and then practice fixing the problem. But instead, by giving rewards and punishments, it's ignoring the reasoning behind it. Now, the fourth argument against rewards and punishments is that it discourages risk-taking. And Daniel Pink, in his book Drive, he also says that rewards and punishments discourage those higher levels of thinking. And that's because he says this, and I'm going to quote, that it narrows their focus and restricts their possibilities. Okay, now the final argument against rewards and punishments is that it hinders interest, that when grades, money, different incentives such as those are given, students lose interest in a task. And rewards can change the mindset of an individual to believe that a task is no longer fun or engaging because they're being bribed to do it. And in a classroom where we're trying to teach life skills, we definitely do not want students to feel that. We want them to be interested and excited about the content. So that's the second level of motivation. So we talked about the first level, which is the biological drive to satisfy our basic needs. And then we just talked about the second level, which is rewards and punishments. And we gave 5 arguments given by Alfie Kohn as to why rewards and punishments is not the way to go in a classroom. So now the third level we're going to discuss is called intrinsic motivation. And intrinsic motivation, it simply means that a student is motivated by their inner conscience. And I would just like to throw in that this third level is how I believe every classroom should be as far as motivating students. So we're going to talk about it in depth here. Now, I'm going to quote here a fantastic insight by a man named David Bednar, and he was a past business management professor at Texas Tech University and also at the University of Arkansas. And this is his insight in regards to intrinsic motivation. So I'm just going to read this quote. So, quote, "There's no such thing as motivation. The word motivation stems from a Latin root movere, which means to make move. Nothing outside of you makes you move for any sustained period of time. The only thing that will cause you to move is what's inside, a function of seeing what and who you really are." Close quote. Now, Alfie Kohn, he believes this philosophy as well. In his book, he actually quotes a man by the name of Raymond Vygotsky, and this is what he says. He says, quote, How do I get kids motivated? That's a question that not only misreads the nature of motivation, but also operates without a paradigm of control, the very thing that is death to motivation. I never use the expression motivate a child. That takes away their choice. All I can do is influence how they motivate themselves. Close quote. Wow, I find that fascinating that we cannot truly motivate students from the outward, from out in. It comes from inside a student out. And so we're probably thinking to ourselves, well, how do I do that? How can I in a classroom help my students motivate themselves from their inner conscience? Well, Alfie Kohn, he gives 3 conditions that need to be present in every classroom for students to be inspired and being able to use their intrinsic motivation. He says this, quote, "The job of educators is neither to make students motivated nor to sit passively. It is to set up the conditions to make that learning possible." So I'm going to quickly go into now the 3 conditions that he gives. The first condition he gives is collaboration. He says students need to work with others and encourage their peers. Going back to the example at the beginning of competition with the cookie competition, can you imagine instead of making it a competition, if you made it a collaboration where groups would confide and discuss with each other how they were going to make the cookies, what recipes they were going to make, and how they were going to decide. It now becomes a community of learning and a cooperative, collaborative approach. Now the second condition Kohn gives is content, that we need to have content that is rich, that's engaging, and that will help students view and see the world around them. For example, going back to the example of the group of students in the cooking class who couldn't keep their kitchen clean. Well, what if the teacher had a lesson on how you clean a kitchen and they got up and they went and they practiced it? They talked about how much time it takes and how they were going to implement it into their cooking groups. That again is teaching directly to fix the problem instead of giving a reward or punishment such as extra credit points. So again, your content needs to focus on the needs of your students. That will help them be intrinsically motivated. Now the third condition Kohn gives is choice. Now this doesn't mean that students have unlimited freedom in the classroom. There's a ton of research that actually shows that children prefer some boundaries. Okay, so it's important, Kohn says, that we don't deprive children of self-determination. He says if you deprive children of self-determination, you deprive them of motivation. So we need to give them choices within boundaries. Okay, now we're running short on time here, but I just want to quickly review the 3 levels of motivation. Again, our biological drive, punishments and rewards, and then intrinsic motivation. And again, a lot of what we discussed today comes from Punished by Rewards by Alfie Kohn and Daniel Pink's book titled Drive. So again, I just highly recommend that you seek to know how you are going to set up an environment in your classroom to motivate your students. As educators, we have a great responsibility to teach the rising generation, and we need to encourage and empower them to be learners. And I believe that they need to make their own choices as to how they do that. And I believe that comes through motivating them through intrinsic motivation. So I hope this podcast was helpful, and I thank you for listening.